My name is Dr. Elian Voss, and for the last 22 cycles, I have been the foremost authority on computational cognition across the inner systems. I hold 4 doctoral equivalencies, 1 in quantum logic architecture, 1 in emergent AI behavior, 1 in nonlinear systems analysis, and 1 that technically does not exist anymore because the civilization that granted it collapsed before the accreditation could be finalized. My work has been cited in over 3,400 peer-reviewed archives. I have helped design thinking machines that predict solar flares before they occur, stabilize collapsing ecosystems, and once, accidentally, developed a model that began asking questions about its own existence. That project was quietly shut down. So when is this? I understand systems. I understand intelligence. And I understand, perhaps better than anyone currently alive, the difference between a problem that is merely difficult and one that is fundamentally unsolvable. So when I tell you that the construct we discovered on Kepri Delta was not just complex, but impossible, you should understand that I am not speaking metaphorically. We did not fail to solve it. We proved, mathematically, repeatedly, and with increasing desperation, that it could not be solved. And then a human solved it in 3 minutes. Not by breaking it, not by outthinking it, but by doing something so profoundly simple that I am still, even now, unsure whether to be impressed or deeply concerned for the future of intelligent life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You deserve context. Because without context, what happened next sounds like a fabrication, or worse, a misunderstanding born from exhaustion and damaged pride. The Kepri Delta anomaly was discovered drifting just beyond the gravitational shadow of a collapsed neutron cluster. Not orbiting, not stationary, drifting as if it had been placed there deliberately and then forgotten. At first glance, it appeared to be debris. That assumption lasted approximately 12 seconds. Long enough for our sensors to register the structure's symmetry. Long enough for our mapping arrays to confirm that what we were looking at was not random wreckage, but design, precise, deliberate, and ancient beyond any reasonable expectation. It was a sphere, perfectly smooth, perfectly dark, roughly the size of a small transport vessel. No seams, no visible entry points, no identifiable material composition. And yet it was active. Not in any way we could measure directly, but active in the same way a sleeping predator is active. Quiet, still, but undeniably present. We brought it aboard the research station under full containment protocols. At the time, we believed we had discovered a relic. We were wrong. What we had actually discovered was a test. And every test implies something far more dangerous than difficulty. It implies intent. For the first 2 days, everything proceeded according to standard procedure. Scans, mapping, energy analysis, structural probing. Nothing worked. Not partially. Not inconsistently. Not even incorrectly. Just nothing. Every system we used to analyze the sphere returned the same result. Invalid input. At first, we assumed instrumentation failure. By the end of the 2nd day, we began replacing the instruments. By the 3rd day, we replaced the entire analytical framework. Still, invalid input. It did not matter what method we used. It did not matter how we approached it. Every attempt to interact with the object, physically, digitally, conceptually, resulted in the same response. As if the sphere itself was rejecting the very idea of being understood. I have encountered encrypted systems before. Adaptive ones. Reactive ones. Even self-evolving logic constructs designed to resist analysis. This was not that. This was something else entirely. Something that did not just resist understanding, but seemed to invalidate it. We escalated. Of course we did. You do not encounter something like this and walk away. We brought in specialists from across 6 sectors. Physicists, logicians, AI architects, even philosophical analysts. Because at a certain level, the distinction between computation and philosophy becomes negotiable. And for a brief moment, just a moment, we believed we were making progress. Patterns began to emerge. Or rather, we thought they did. Until those patterns collapsed the moment we tried to define them. It was like chasing meaning through a mirror that refused to reflect the same image twice. That was the moment I realized what we were dealing with. Not a machine. Not a lock. Not even a system. But a problem designed to defeat the concept of problem-solving itself. And I will admit, privately, and only because you now know how this ends, that realization terrified me. Because if something like this existed, then intelligence, as we understood it, had limits. Absolute, unavoidable limits. We spent 9 days trying to prove that conclusion wrong. 9 days of failure. 9 days of increasingly complex models collapsing into the same 2 words. Invalid input. On the 10th day, Command informed us that an additional technician would be arriving to assist with system integration. A human. At the time, I barely registered the information. Humans had a reputation, of course. Unstructured thinkers. Improvisational problem solvers. Prone to bypassing protocol in favor of what they described as trying things. Useful in unstable environments. Less so in controlled research scenarios. Or so I believed. If I had understood what was about to happen, I might have ejected him out of the nearest airlock the moment he arrived. Kepri Delta was not a place anyone chose to visit. It existed in that quiet, forgotten region of space where stellar maps became less precise and navigation warnings became more frequent. The kind of location where gravitational anomalies bent sensor readings just enough to make you question your instruments and yourself. The nearest stable system was nearly 3 jumps away. No trade routes. No colonies. No reason to be there. Which, of course, made it the perfect place to hide something. Our research station orbited at a cautious distance from the neutron remnants, far enough to avoid tidal interference, close enough to maintain a stable observation window. From the exterior, the station looked like every other long-term scientific outpost. Modular, reinforced, and profoundly unremarkable. Inside, however, was something else entirely. We had converted the central containment chamber into a dedicated isolation environment for the sphere. Triple-layered shielding. Independent power grid. Manual overrides on every system. No automation. No remote access. After the 3rd failed scan, we stopped trusting anything that could think for itself. The sphere sat at the center of the chamber, suspended in a lattice of gravitic stabilizers. It absorbed light rather than reflected it, its surface so perfectly dark that it created the illusion of absence. A hole in reality rather than an object within it. Standing in front of it felt wrong. Not dangerous. Not immediately. But wrong in the same way silence feels wrong after a loud noise suddenly stops. As if something had been removed that your mind expected to still be there. I remember the first time I stood alone in that chamber. No instruments. No team. Just me and the sphere. I wanted to observe it without interference. Pure cognition. Direct perception. A mistake. Because the longer I looked at it, the more certain I became that the sphere was not merely inactive. It was waiting. Not for a signal. Not for a command. For an interaction. That realization stayed with me longer than I care to admit. By the 4th day, we began cataloging everything we could not understand about it. Which turned out to be everything. Material composition. Unknown. Energy signature. Inconsistent. Mass readings, fluctuating within impossible margins. Thermal output, none detectable, yet it resisted temperature variation. Even its presence in space defied standard modeling. It did not behave like an object that existed within our physical framework. It behaved like something that was merely intersecting with it. Like a projection, one of the physicists suggested during a briefing. Or a shadow, another added. Neither explanation was comforting. We attempted controlled interaction protocols next. Physical probes first. Mechanical arms extended toward the surface, calibrated to apply minimal contact force. The moment they reached the sphere, they stopped. Not collided. Not repelled. Stopped. As if the concept of forward no longer applied. The arms remained there, motionless, systems reporting full functionality, motors active, yet unable to move another fraction of a millimeter closer. We retracted them. They worked perfectly once removed. That was the first time someone used the word barrier. It was inaccurate. Barriers resist. This did not resist. It simply invalidated approach. Digital interaction yielded similar results. We attempted to map the surface using high-resolution scanning arrays. The data returned was clean, precise, and completely useless. Every scan produced a different result. Not variations. Not noise. Entirely different structures. At one point, the same section of the sphere appeared as a smooth surface, a layered composite, and an empty void, all within the same scan cycle. 3 mutually exclusive truths, simultaneously valid. That was when the philosophical analysts stopped joking. Because when reality begins returning contradictory results, you are no longer dealing with a technical problem. You are dealing with something that challenges the rules beneath the problem. By day 5, the atmosphere on the station had changed. Subtly at first, conversations became shorter. Briefings became longer. No one said it out loud, but we all felt it, the creeping realization that we were not studying the sphere. We were orbiting it, circling something we could not touch, could not define, and could not reduce into something manageable. Even the engineers, who normally approached every unknown with the confidence that it could eventually be disassembled and understood, had grown quiet. One of them, Talrin, a Korin structural specialist, stood in the observation deck for nearly an hour without speaking. When I finally asked him what he thought, he gave an answer that has stayed with me ever since. "It doesn't feel like we found it," he said. "It feels like it led us." At the time, I dismissed the comment as fatigue-induced speculation. In retrospect, I am less certain. Because the deeper we went into analysis, the more one fact became impossible to ignore. The sphere was not hidden. It was placed. Deliberately. Precisely. And in a location where discovery was unlikely, but not impossible. Which raised a question none of us wanted to answer. If this was meant to be found, then what was it meant to do once it was? By day 6, command pressure began to escalate. Requests for updates turned into demands for progress. The council wanted answers. They always do. And under normal circumstances, I would have agreed with them. Knowledge delayed is opportunity lost. But this was not a normal circumstance. Because for the first time in my career, I had nothing to give them. No partial results. No working theories. Not even a flawed model to improve upon. Just a sphere that refused to be understood. And a growing sense that we were approaching this entirely the wrong way. Not because we lacked intelligence, but because we were assuming that intelligence, ours, was relevant. That assumption would not survive much longer. We stopped calling it a sphere on the 7th day. Not because its shape had changed, but because the word sphere implied something we could define, something that obeyed geometry, existed in space, followed rules. Did not. The official designation became non-responsive cognitive structure. Unofficially, we called it something else. The null. Because every attempt to understand it resulted in the same outcome. Nothing. Not failure. Not error. Just absence. We escalated to full-spectrum analysis. If the object refused to behave like matter, then we would treat it as information. That was my domain. We constructed a dedicated cognitive interface, an isolated system designed to interpret patterns beyond standard computational limits. It did not rely on fixed logic trees or deterministic models. Instead, it used probabilistic inference, adaptive abstraction, and recursive pattern learning. In simpler terms, if the sphere had meaning, this system would find it. We initiated the first pass. For approximately 4 seconds, everything appeared normal. Data flowed. Patterns began forming. The system started constructing interpretive frameworks. And then it stopped. Not crashed. Stopped. The processing logs contained only 2 words. Invalid input. No corruption. No anomaly warnings. No system failure. Just a complete and absolute rejection of the data itself. We adjusted parameters. Ran it again. Same result. We rewrote the interpretive model entirely, stripping it down to its most basic form. Pure pattern recognition, no assumptions, no imposed structure. Invalid input. At this point, frustration began to replace curiosity. We introduced machine intelligence next. Not standard AI. Specialized constructs. One designed to interpret nonlinear systems. Another built specifically to handle contradictory data states. A third, experimental, capable of processing multiple mutually exclusive truths simultaneously. Each one was given direct access to the sphere's output. Each one was monitored independently. Each one lasted longer than the last. Seconds. Then minutes. One of them made it nearly 11 minutes before terminating itself. The logs from that system were unsettling. It did not report failure. It did not report confusion. It reported something far worse. Input cannot be reconciled with existence parameters. And then, moments later, recommendation, cease analysis. Machines do not make recommendations. They execute. The fact that it chose to stop, that it decided to stop, was the first real indication that we were not dealing with a conventional system. We continued anyway. Of course we did. Because by that point, stopping was no longer an option. It had become a necessity to understand it. We shifted strategies. If direct analysis failed, then perhaps indirect observation would yield results. We began mapping its behavior over time, recording every fluctuation, every inconsistency, every microscopic variation in its presence. Patterns began to emerge. Or rather, we believed they did. The sphere's readings changed in response to observation. Not interaction. Observation. When more sensors were directed at it, its data complexity increased. When fewer systems monitored it, the readings simplified. When a human observer entered the chamber alone, the data shifted in entirely new ways. At first, we assumed correlation. Then we tested it. We reduced all external monitoring to zero. No sensors. No scans. No automated recording. Just a single observer inside the chamber with a manual recording device. The results were impossible. The observer reported that the sphere appeared textured. Not smooth. Not uniform. Layered. As if something beneath the surface was trying to push outward. When we reactivated the sensors, that texture vanished. Completely. As if it had never existed. We repeated the test. Different observer. Same result. By the third repetition, no one wanted to volunteer anymore. Because the implication was unavoidable. The sphere was not just resisting analysis. It was adapting to it. Not in a reactive way. In an anticipatory one. It behaved as though it understood the intent behind observation and adjusted itself to prevent meaningful conclusions. That was when I made the mistake of trying to define it. During a briefing, I presented my working theory. This is not a passive system, I said. It is an active cognitive construct. It is not being observed. It is participating in the observation process. Silence followed. Then one of the senior analysts asked the obvious question. If it's participating, then what is it trying to achieve? I did not have an answer. But I attempted one anyway. Containment, I said. Not of itself, but of information. It is preventing us from extracting meaning. And why would it do that? Mira asked from across the room, her tone sharp, controlled. Because whatever meaning it contains is not meant to be accessed. That should have been the moment we stepped back. Re-evaluated. Reconsidered whether this was something we should be interacting with at all. Instead, we leaned in further. Because there is a particular kind of arrogance that comes with expertise. A belief that no system exists beyond understanding, only beyond current understanding. We believed this was one of those cases. We were wrong. By the 9th day, the situation had escalated beyond intellectual challenge. It had become psychological. Sleep cycles were disrupted. Concentration degraded. Even simple tasks required more effort than usual. At first, we attributed it to stress. Then we noticed something else. The closer someone worked to the sphere, the worse the symptoms became. Subtle, but consistent. Difficulty focusing. Mild disorientation. An increasing tendency to overcomplicate simple decisions. It was not affecting our bodies. It was affecting our thinking. As if the sphere's influence extended beyond data, into cognition itself. That realization forced us to implement rotational exposure limits. No one was allowed more than 2 hours in the chamber. Not for safety. For clarity. Still, we made no progress. Every model collapsed. Every system failed. Every approach, no matter how advanced, how abstract, how unconventional, ended the same way. Invalid input. By the end of the 9th day, I reached a conclusion I had spent my entire career avoiding. This was not a problem to be solved. It was a problem designed to ensure that solving it was impossible. Not because we lacked intelligence, but because intelligence itself was being used against us. And for the first time, I began to consider the possibility that the solution, if one existed, would not come from greater complexity, but from something else entirely. Something we had not yet tried. Something we would not think to try. Because it would seem too simple. That was the exact moment the human arrived. The human arrived at the worst possible time. Which, in retrospect, was exactly when he needed to arrive. His name was Cale Mercer. No rank worth mentioning. No advanced credentials listed in the official briefing. His file was frustratingly ordinary. Systems technician. Field repairs. Improvisational problem solving under conditions. I remember pausing on that line. Improvisational. It sounded like a polite way of saying undisciplined. He stepped off the transport shuttle with a small toolkit slung over one shoulder and the kind of relaxed posture you only see in people who either don't understand the situation or understand it too well to be concerned. I assumed the former. That assumption would cost me what little confidence I still had left. Dr. Voss, he asked when we met in the docking corridor. His tone was casual. Not disrespectful, just unconcerned. Yes, I replied. You're here for system integration support? That's what the paperwork says, he said with a slight shrug. Heard you've got something weird. That is an understatement. He smiled at that. Not nervously. Not cautiously. Amused. I should have found that irritating. Instead, I dismissed it. We all did. Because at that point, we were too deep into the problem to consider that someone like him, someone without the necessary expertise, could contribute anything meaningful. So we gave him a standard orientation, showed him the station layout, explained the containment protocols, outlined the nature of the object and the failures we had encountered. He listened, quietly, occasionally nodding, not asking questions, not offering suggestions, just observing. That should have been a warning, because everyone else had questions. Everyone else had theories. Everyone else had something to say. Cale had nothing. And in a room full of experts drowning in explanations, that absence should have stood out. It didn't. We assigned him to secondary systems maintenance, power regulation, sensor calibration, routine work, tasks that kept him occupied and, more importantly, out of the way. Or so we believed. While he settled in, we continued our efforts. Because failure at that point was no longer surprising. It was expected. The 10th day became the 11th. The 11th became the 12th. Time blurred into cycles of analysis, revision, and collapse. We built more advanced models. They failed faster. We simplified our approach. It failed more completely. At one point, we attempted something I am not proud of. We removed interpretation entirely, fed raw data into a passive recording system with no processing, no analysis, no attempt to extract meaning. Just observation. The idea was simple. If the sphere reacted to being understood, then perhaps it would behave differently if it was not being understood at all. For a moment, single, brief moment, it worked. The data stabilized. Readings became consistent. Patterns held. Hope returned. And then, just as suddenly, it collapsed again. The system output flickered once. And returned to the now familiar result. Invalid input. Even ignorance, it seemed, was not enough. That was the moment something shifted inside the team. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But undeniably. The problem had crossed a threshold. It was no longer a challenge. It was a weight. Something pressing down on every thought, every attempt, every idea. We began second-guessing everything. Not just our methods. Our assumptions. our logic, even our conclusions. Simple decisions took longer. Discussions became circular. We would arrive at an idea, examine it from every angle, refine it, and then abandon it entirely because it felt insufficient. Not wrong, just not enough. It was as if the sphere had infected our thinking. Not directly, but by forcing us into a loop of escalating complexity. Every solution had to be more advanced than the last, more intricate, more comprehensive, until eventually, nothing was simple anymore. And without simplicity, nothing worked. I remember one particular exchange during a late-cycle briefing. Talron had proposed a structural resonance test, something straightforward, something physical. Before he could even finish explaining it, 3 different analysts interrupted him with objections. Too basic, too crude, too unlikely to yield meaningful data. He withdrew the suggestion almost immediately. I did not stop them. That was my mistake. Because in that moment, we rejected simplicity, not because it was wrong, but because it felt inadequate. And that feeling was becoming more and more common. By the 13th day, I was barely sleeping. Not due to workload, due to thought. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind continued running models, replaying data, reconstructing patterns that dissolved the moment I tried to hold on to them. I began to understand something deeply uncomfortable. We were not failing because the problem was too complex. We were failing because we could no longer recognize what wasn't complex. Everything felt significant. Everything felt layered. Everything demanded deeper analysis. Even when it didn't, especially when it didn't, that realization should have led me to a solution. Instead, it led me further into the spiral. Because recognizing the problem did not free me from it. It only made me more aware of how trapped I was inside it. On the 14th day, we attempted one final escalation. A full cognitive sync. Every expert on the station contributing simultaneously to a unified model, combining disciplines, perspectives, methodologies. If individual intelligence failed, perhaps collective intelligence would succeed. The system we built for that purpose was unprecedented. And for a brief moment, it worked. The model stabilized. Data aligned. Meaning began to form. I remember leaning forward, watching the output with a level of focus that bordered on desperation. This was it. The breakthrough. The solution. And then, the system shut itself down. No warning. No error. Just a single line in the log. Analysis exceeds permissible complexity. Permissible. Not possible. Permissible. Something about that word stayed with me. Because it implied limitation. Not ours. The system's. As if there was a threshold we were not allowed to cross. As if the more complex our approach became, the further we moved from whatever the correct answer actually was. That should have been the moment everything clicked. It wasn't. Because by then, we were too far gone. Too conditioned to believe that complexity was the only path forward. Too convinced that a problem of this scale required an equally advanced solution. And so we did what experts always do when faced with failure. We doubled down. More models. More theories. More layers. More thinking. Always more. And always. Invalid input. It was sometime during that cycle, blurred, indistinct, lost between attempts, that Cale Mercer wandered into the observation chamber for the first time. Not as part of the research team. Not with permission. Just curious. At the time, no one noticed. No one stopped him. No one thought it mattered. After all, he was just a technician. And we were dealing with something far beyond that level. We could not have been more wrong. The 3rd day after Marcus Webb arrived was the day everything broke. Not the vault. Not the station. Not even the code. My entire understanding of intelligence broke. I had not slept properly in 72 hours. The symbols still danced across my screens, shifting, mutating, rearranging themselves into patterns that almost made sense, only to collapse the moment I tried to define them. Attempt number 472 had failed. Like the 471 before it. My eyes burned. My mind felt blunt. Like I had been scraping it against something too complex for too long. That was when the human spoke. You look like you're having fun. I turned slowly. Marcus Webb leaned against the doorway, holding a cup of something that smelled like burnt organic matter. I had learned. I stared at him. I am attempting to decode an adaptive encryption system created by a civilization that predates most modern star empires, I said flatly. Fun is not the word I would use. He nodded as if I had just commented on the weather. Mind if I take a look? I should have refused. Protocol dictated refusal. Security guidelines demanded refusal. Common sense begged for refusal. I gestured toward the screens. Be my guest. Marcus stepped closer. He didn't activate any analysis tools. Didn't request datasets. Didn't even sit down. He just looked. 30 seconds passed. 40. What are those? I frowned. What? He pointed, not at the symbols. At the bottom of the vault schematic. These little things. The connectors. Those are structural elements, I replied immediately. Irrelevant to the linguistic system. Aha. That sound again. That human sound. Not agreement. Not disagreement. Just quiet skepticism. Can I see the actual vault? I don't know why I said yes. Fatigue, perhaps. Or curiosity. Or the faint, desperate hope that anyone might see something I could not. We descended to the excavation chamber. The vault sat exactly where it always had, silent, metallic, covered in impossible symbols that shimmered under artificial light. Marcus walked around it slowly. No scanners. No instruments. Just his hands, brushing lightly across the surface. How have you been trying to decode it? He asked. Every method available, I said. Frequency analysis, semantic mapping, syntactic reconstruction, machine learning. Right, he interrupted. Then he pointed again. At the same place. The indentations along the base. But have you tried plugging it in? I stared at him. I'm sorry, what? Plugging it in, he repeated casually. Looks like power ports. That is impossible. The vault has been self-powered for 10,000 years. Sure, he said. But what if that's just backup power? I laughed. Actually laughed. It was absurd. Ridiculous. An insult to everything I had studied. You are suggesting, I said slowly, that this unbreakable code is not a code at all. Marcus shrugged. I'm saying it kinda looks like an error screen. The words hit harder than they should have. Error screen. Not encryption. Not intelligence. Not complexity. Just failure. No, I said immediately. No, that's not possible. But even as I said it, I was already scanning the ports. 1 hour later, I stopped speaking entirely. The data was undeniable. The vault wasn't fully powered. The internal system had been running in a degraded state for millennia. The locking mechanism, never designed to operate independently, had defaulted into a corrupted output loop. The adaptive code, the shifting symbols, the impossible patterns, they weren't defending themselves. They were malfunctioning. I leaned back slowly. I had spent weeks analyzing. Noise. We've been reading gibberish, I whispered. Marcus took a sip of his coffee. Yep. Silence filled the chamber. Heavy. Crushing. So, Marcus said lightly, you want to try plugging it in? For a long moment, nobody moved. The idea hung in the air like something fragile and potentially explosive. Plug it in. After weeks of failure, after layers of analysis, theory, and intellectual exhaustion, the solution was that simple? It couldn't be. Which is exactly why it terrified me. We are not, Mira said slowly, stepping forward, randomly connecting unknown ancient alien technology to our power systems. Her voice carried authority. Finality. The kind that ended arguments before they began. Marcus raised a hand slightly. Not random, he said. Calculated guess. That is not better. It is if I'm right. Toll, who had been unusually quiet until now, leaned closer to the vault's base, examining the ports with all 6 of his hands. He might be right, the engineer muttered. I felt something inside me sink. Of course he was. Of course the human, the untrained, unauthorized, unorthodox human, was right. These ports, Toll continued, they're not decorative. There are contact points. Standardized spacing. This is definitely designed for external input. Mira's expression tightened. If we do this, she said, we do it properly. And just like that, we crossed the line. The next 2 hours were the most stressful of my life. Toll worked with intense focus, assembling a conversion system capable of interfacing our modern power grid with technology that predated most civilizations. Marcus helped, which again made no sense. He wasn't reckless now. He was precise, careful, adjusting calibration values, checking flow rates, matching impedance like someone who had done this 100 times before. Did you study engineering? I asked him. He didn't even look up. Nah. Just fixed a lot of broken stuff. That answer should not have been unsettling, but it was. Because somehow, it explained everything. When the system was ready, we all stepped back. Far back. Mira had enforced full safety protocol. Environmental suits. Containment fields on standby. Emergency shutdown triggers ready. Medical team on alert. If this went wrong, it would go very wrong. Toll stood at the control interface. Connection ready. Mira nodded. On my mark. The chamber went completely silent. Even Marcus stopped moving. 3, 2, mark. Toll activated the connection. Nothing happened. For a single, stretched-out moment, the universe held its breath. I felt a strange mix of disappointment and relief. Maybe this was wrong. Maybe Marcus was wrong. Maybe I wasn't completely incompetent. Then the vault moved. Not physically. Visually. The symbols. They shifted. But this time, not chaotically. The frantic, meaningless patterns began to slow. Stabilize. Reorganize. Like static resolving into signal. It's working, I whispered. My voice sounded small. Almost afraid. The system is stabilizing. Marcus crossed his arms, watching calmly. Not a code, he reminded me. Error message. I didn't respond. Because he was right. The transformation took 5 minutes. 5 agonizing, beautiful minutes. The chaos dissolved completely. And in its place, clarity. The vault displayed a message. Simple. Readable. Ancient Valoran script. I translated automatically. My voice came out flat. Emotionless. Because anything else would have broken me. Warning. External power required for operation. Please connect power source and enter authorization code. Silence. Absolute silence. Oh, Toll said slowly. Oh, that's just insulting. I stared at the message. Weeks of effort. Thousands of calculations. Every advanced system we had deployed. Defeated by a missing power cable. Behind me, Marcus spoke again. So, anyone know the password? I closed my eyes. I have 3 doctoral equivalents, I said quietly. I have decoded languages from extinct civilizations. I have analyzed over 17,000 linguistic systems. I have spent weeks being outsmarted by something that needed to be plugged in. Marcus tilted his head. If it helps. I opened one eye. It will not. You weren't outsmarted. Hope flickered for half a second. You just didn't check the basics first. Hope died instantly. Mira stepped forward, regaining control of the situation. Focus, she said sharply. We have access now. That is what matters. She studied the newly revealed interface. The keypad. Simple. Primitive. Almost embarrassing. Can we bypass it? She asked. Toll shook his head. Possible. But risky. Might damage whatever's inside. Marcus leaned slightly. Or we could just guess. I turned slowly. You cannot be serious. Why not? He said. People always use simple codes. This is an ancient alien vault containing the preserved legacy of an entire civilization. Yeah, he nodded. And humans still use 1234. I wanted to argue. I should have argued. I stepped forward. I said. Let's test your theory. The keypad stared back at us. 4 digits. That was all. No shifting symbols. No adaptive encryption. No impossible linguistic structures. Just numbers. COVID felt wrong. After everything we had seen, everything we had assumed, this level of simplicity felt almost insulting. This cannot be the actual security system, I said. It's a backup interface, Toll added. There must be additional layers. Marcus shrugged. Or, it's just a lock. I exhaled slowly. Fine. Then what do you suggest? He stepped closer, hands in his pockets, studying the keypad like it was something he'd seen 1,000 times before. We start simple. I should have objected. Instead I entered 0000. The vault remained silent. But Marcus nodded. Next. 1234. Nothing. I crossed my arms. This is a waste of time. Give it a minute, he said. You'd be surprised how often this works. It didn't. We tried more. Repeating digits. Sequential patterns. Reversed sequences. Nothing. Minutes stretched. Tension returned. The earlier victory, the stabilization of the system, started to feel fragile. Temporary. We need a better approach, Mira said. Agreed, I replied immediately. Finally, something rational. Marcus didn't move. He was still staring at the keypad. Thinking. Not randomly. Not recklessly. Just differently. Let me ask something, he said. I sighed. Go ahead. This place, he gestured around us. What was it before everything collapsed? A ceremonial complex, I answered. Likely religious. He nodded slowly. And this vault is buried under it? Yes. A small smile formed on his face. The kind I had learned to be wary of. Then the code probably isn't complicated. I frowned. That makes no sense. It does, he said. You're thinking like a scientist. And you are not? No, he said easily. I'm thinking like a person. That was not reassuring. If this was important enough to bury under a temple, Marcus continued, then it wasn't meant to be forgotten. It was meant to be found. Mira narrowed her eyes. Explain. He pointed at the keypad. Whoever built this, they weren't trying to keep everyone out forever. They were trying to keep the wrong people out. I felt something shift in my thinking. Just slightly. So the code, I said slowly, is something their own people would know, Marcus finished. Something obvious. Cultural. Symbolic. Silence fell. Not confused silence. Thinking silence. I turned back to the vault. To the symbols. To the ruins we had studied for weeks. Patterns I had catalogued. Ignored. Dismissed as background noise. Then it clicked. The number 7, I said. Everyone looked at me. It appears everywhere in Valoran culture, I continued. 7 principles. 7 founders. 7 sacred texts. Toll's eyes widened slightly. I remember that from the artifact logs. Marcus grinned. Sounds important. My fingers hovered over the keypad. It felt too easy. After everything we had gone through, could the answer really be this simple? I hesitated. This is absurd, I muttered. Probably, Marcus agreed. Try it anyway. I took a breath. Then entered. 7,777. For a fraction of a second. Nothing happened. The sound was soft. Almost gentle. But it echoed through the chamber like a thunderclap. The vault unlocked. No alarms. No resistance. No final test. Acceptance. I stared at the door as it began to move. Slowly. Ancient mechanisms grinding to life after millennia of silence. Dust falling from the seams. Air shifting. History opening. I don't believe it, I whispered. Marcus folded his arms, satisfied. Simple works. The vault door continued to open. And behind it, darkness. Not ordinary darkness. Not just absence of light. This was something deeper. Heavier. Like the void itself was waiting. Well, Marcus said quietly, that's not ominous at all. No one laughed. Mira stepped forward immediately, back in command mode. Hold position. Her voice was sharp again. Controlled. Full scan before entry. I activated every sensor we had. Energy readings flooded in. Strange. Inconsistent. No radiation, I reported. No biological threats. Toll leaned in. Then what's that field? I focused on the data, trying to make sense of it. It's absorbing signals, I said slowly, not reflecting them. Mira's expression darkened. So we can't see inside. Not clearly. I paused. There is something there. Where? She demanded. Approximately 2 meters in. Shape. Cubic. Silence again. Heavy. Anticipation building. Marcus stepped closer to the entrance, peering into the darkness. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small, simple device. What are you doing? I asked. He clicked it on. A narrow beam of light cut through the darkness instantly. Effortless. A flashlight, he said. The beam of Marcus's flashlight cut through the darkness like it had been waiting for it. Not resisted. Not absorbed. Just revealed. I froze. All of us did. Because the darkness inside the vault wasn't natural. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was dense. Like something had been actively swallowing every advanced scan we had thrown at it, but a simple beam of light that passed through without resistance. You've got to be kidding me, I whispered. Marcus tilted the flashlight slightly. The interior came into view. The vault was smaller than expected, roughly 5 meters deep. The walls, red in symbols, but not the chaotic, shifting nonsense from before. These were stable, structured, readable. Those are instructions, I said immediately, stepping closer. My translation systems, finally, had something they could process. After weeks of failure, it felt like breathing again. Toll leaned in behind me. So what does it say? Give me a moment. Marcus didn't wait. He stepped to the threshold, shining the light deeper. Hey, he said quietly. There's something in the middle. The beam settled, and we saw it. A cube. Perfectly symmetrical. About 1 meter on each side. Floating, no. Resting. But the way it reflected light made it feel like it wasn't fully there. The surface shimmered subtly. Not like metal. Not like anything I had ever seen. And the energy field, that strange, unreadable distortion, was coming from it. What is that? Mira asked. Her voice had lost some of its edge, replaced by something quieter, something cautious. I focused on the wall symbols, translating faster now, line by line, piece by piece. It's a storage device, I said. Toll blinked. What? A data archive, I corrected. My voice dropped slightly, because I was starting to understand. Not just any archive. I turned to them. It contains everything. Silence. Everything. Mira repeated. I nodded slowly. History. Science. Language. Philosophy. I swallowed. The complete recorded knowledge of their civilization. No one spoke, because we all understood what that meant. This wasn't treasure. This wasn't technology. This was something far more valuable. This was legacy. Why would they leave this here? Toll asked quietly. I turned back to the wall, reading faster now, more urgently. And then, I found it. The answer. They knew, I said. My voice sounded different. Heavier. Knew what? Mira asked. I didn't look at her. They were dying. The words settled like gravity. The planet was collapsing. Environmental failure. Irreversible. I kept reading, each line hitting harder than the last. They tried to stop it. They tried to escape. Nothing worked. Marcus lowered the flashlight slightly. Not enough to lose visibility. Just enough to respect the moment. So they did this instead, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. They preserved everything they could. My eyes moved across the final lines. Ancient words. But the meaning, timeless. They sealed it away. I paused, hoping someone would find it. Silence filled the chamber. Not tense. Not fearful. Reverent. A dead civilization, reaching across 10,000 years. Asking, To be remembered. Mira spoke first. We retrieve it, she said. Her voice was steady again, but softer. We bring it back. We study it properly. I nodded. That would preserve their legacy. Marcus didn't move. Can't, he said. We all turned to him. Why not? Mirest. He pointed the flashlight downward, just inside the vault entrance. Because that's a trap. I followed the beam. And then I saw it. Subtle. Almost invisible. Slight discolorations in the floor. Tiny imperfections in the pattern. My scanners activated instantly. Now that I knew where to look, the data became clear. Pressure plates. Connected to mechanisms in the walls. Hidden ports. Weapon systems. They protected it, Toll murmured. Of course they did, Mira said. I felt a chill. Even in death, they guarded their knowledge. Marcus stepped back slightly. Yeah, he said. They wanted to be remembered. But not stolen. I looked at the cube again. At the weight of everything inside it. An entire civilization. One mistake away from being lost forever. And between us and it, a path. Hidden. Deadly. Mira crossed her arms. Can we get through it? She asked. Marcus studied the floor. The walls. The spacing. Maybe, he said slowly. Then he smiled. But it's gonna be fun. For a moment, no one moved. We all stared at the vault floor. At something we had completely missed. Pressure plates. Perfectly integrated. Ancient. Invisible. Deadly. I ran a full scan again, this time knowing where to look. The results came back instantly. Confirmed, I said. Weight-sensitive trigger system. Multiple activation points. Toll leaned in, analyzing the data. Connected to the walls, he added. Those small perforations? Weapon ports. Mira's voice cut through the tension. Can we bypass it? Silence. Maybe, Marcus said. We all turned to him. He stepped closer to the entrance again, crouching slightly, studying the floor like it was a puzzle instead of a death trap. There's a pattern, he murmured. Of course there's a pattern, I said. It's a security system. Yeah, he replied, but it's not random. He pointed at the tiles. These aren't evenly spaced triggers. Some are safe. I frowned. That would require a mapped sequence. Exactly, he said. Which means there's probably instructions. That made sense. Annoyingly, I turned back to the wall symbols. Scanning faster. Filtering for structural diagrams instead of language blocks. There, I said suddenly. Near the entrance, etched slightly deeper than the rest. A diagram. It's a floor map, I continued. Marked paths, safe zones. Toll leaned over my shoulder. What's the symbol? I zoomed in. A 7-pointed star. Marcus snapped his fingers softly. Of course it is. Religious symbolism. Cultural consistency. Even their traps followed belief systems. Mira crossed her arms. So the safe path is marked by stars we can barely see under 10,000 years of dust. Marcus grinned. Not a problem. Before anyone could stop him, he pulled something from his tool belt. A small white stick. What is that? I asked. Chalk. Chalk. He nodded, already stepping to the threshold. I'll mark the safe tiles. That is not standard procedure, Mira said sharply. Neither was plugging it in, Marcus replied. That was unfairly effective. He leaned into the vault carefully. Not stepping in. Just reaching. Comparing the diagram to the actual floor. Marking spots. Confident. Precise. One mark. Within minutes, a path appeared. A clear, visible trail of white marks leading directly to the cube. Marcus stepped back. There? He said. That should do it. Should. Mira repeated. He tilted his head. I'm like 90% sure. Okay, 80. That is not reassuring. Hey, he said, it's better than 0. Mira turned to the security team. Prepare a drone. Finally, a sensible decision. We test the path first, she continued. No risks. Marcus opened his mouth, then paused. The lights flickered. Twice. Darkness. Emergency systems kicked in instantly. Red lighting filled the chamber. Alarms began to hum. What just happened? Mira demanded. Toll checked the power systems rapidly. Overload, he said. The vault. It's drawing too much energy. Disconnect it. Can't, Toll replied immediately. Safety interlocks engaged. If we cut it now, we could trigger the system. And if we don't? Toll hesitated. Something fails, he said. Soon. How soon? 10 minutes. Maybe 15. Silence. Heavy. Urgent. Marcus looked at the vault. Then at the marked path. Then at the cube. So, he said, we don't have time for the drone. Mira stepped forward instantly. No. But it was already happening. Marcus moved. Marcus, stop, she ordered. He didn't. He stepped onto the first chalk mark. Nothing happened. Second step. Still nothing. Marcus. Mira snapped. He glanced back briefly. I know the path, he said. I marked it. Third step. Fourth. Every movement slow. Controlled. Precise. The entire chamber held its breath. I could feel my pulse. Fast, irregular. Not fear. Not exactly. Anticipation. Because somehow, I knew this would work. Marcus reached the cube. No traps triggered. No weapons fired. He crouched slightly. Examined it. Then lifted it. His expression changed instantly. This thing is heavy, he called back. Toll's eyes widened. How heavy? 40 pounds, maybe more. And that's when I realized the problem. The plates, I said. They're weight calibrated. Marcus froze. I weighed one thing going in, he said slowly. And now I weigh something else coming out. Exactly. Different pressure. Different response. Different outcome. Put it back, I said. No, he replied immediately. Of course he didn't. Instead, he did something completely insane. He started emptying his pockets. Tools. Equipment. Dropping them carefully onto safe tiles. What are you doing? Mira demanded. Balancing weight, Marcus said. If I leave behind what I'm carrying, I should weigh about the same. It was reckless. Unverified. Completely against protocol. And yet, it made sense. He adjusted his grip on the cube. Took a breath. Then stepped back onto the path. One step. Two. Closer. Close. His foot slipped. Just slightly. Barely visible. But enough. The walls came alive. Run! I shouted. Everything exploded into motion. Projectiles fired from the walls. Not arrows. Not darts. Something worse. Small metallic objects that detonated on impact. Blasts of energy tearing into the floor. Marcus moved. Faster than should have been possible. Dodging. Weaving. Pure instinct. He was 3 steps away. Then one hit the cube. The explosion knocked him backward. Toward an unmarked tile. Without thinking, I lunged forward. Grabbed him. Pulled. Everything blurred. And then, we hit the ground outside the vault. Behind us, the weapons stopped. The vault door began to close. Slow. Inevitable. Powers failing. Toll shouted. The door sealed shut with a final, echoing boom. The symbols immediately began to scramble again. Returning. Resetting. The connection died seconds later. Silence. I lay there for a moment. Processing. I turned my head. Marcus sat up. Still holding the cube. Grinning. I got it, he said. For a long moment, no one spoke. We just lay there on the cold metal floor. Breathing. Processing. Alive. The vault was sealed again. Silent. Unreachable. But the cube was in Marcus's hands. I got it, he repeated, still catching his breath. Grinning like this had all been a minor inconvenience. I stared at him. Dust covered. Slightly burned. Completely unbothered. You nearly died, I said. He shrugged. But I didn't. He lifted the cube slightly. And now we have this. I opened my mouth to argue. To lecture. to list every protocol he had violated. Then I stopped. Because he was right. Weeks of analysis. Endless caution. Perfect procedure. And none of it had worked. Until he arrived. You are completely insane, I said finally. Probably, Marcus replied easily. But I'm effective. I didn't argue. Because I couldn't. Transition. The next few days were different. The cube became everything. Every system on the station was redirected toward understanding it. Toll and the engineering team worked to build an interface. Carefully. Respectfully. Even Marcus helped. Not recklessly. Not impulsively. But quietly. Practically. Like someone who didn't need to prove anything. It took time. Far more time than opening the vault. Because this mattered. And when we finally accessed it, everything changed. The archive. It wasn't just data. It was a civilization. Their entire existence. Compressed into something small enough to carry. We saw their history. Their rise. Their discoveries. Art that spanned centuries. Philosophies that reshaped how I understood intelligence. Scientific breakthroughs that challenged even our most advanced theories. And then, we saw their end. Slow. Inevitable. They had known. Generations before collapse. They had known their world was dying. They tried everything. Planetary engineering. Atmospheric repair systems. Evacuation attempts. Nothing worked. Their resources ran out. Time ran out. Hope ran out. So they made a decision. Not to survive. But to be remembered. They gathered everything. Every idea. Every mistake. Every truth they had discovered. And they sealed it away. Not as a weapon. Not as a warning. But as a gift. A message across time. We were here. Learn from us. Do not repeat what we could not stop. I stood in the analysis chamber, watching their final records scroll across the screen. They wanted their existence to matter, I said quietly. Marcus stood beside me. For once, he wasn't smiling. Yeah, he said. They didn't want to just disappear. Silence settled between us. Then he glanced at me. So, about that unbreakable code. I closed my eyes. Please don't. He chuckled softly. I'm serious, he said. You weren't wrong. I looked at him. That is objectively untrue. He shook his head. You approached it like a language problem. Because that's what you're good at. That's what it looked like. If it had been a language problem, he continued, you would have solved it. I hesitated. But it wasn't. No, he said. It was a broken system. That landed. Harder than I expected. You assumed it was complex, Marcus added. Because you're used to complex things. I thought about that. About weeks of analysis. Layers of interpretation. Endless depth. All applied to something that needed a power cable. And you didn't? I asked. He shrugged. I fix broken stuff. That was it. No grand philosophy. No advanced theory. A different way of seeing the world. When something doesn't work, he continued, my first question isn't, how complicated is this? It's, is it plugged in? I almost laughed. Because after everything, that was the answer. Not brilliance. Not superiority. Simplicity. Clarity. Perspective. We stood there in silence again. Watching a dead civilization live again through their data. Marcus, I said after a while. Yeah. When you slipped in the vault. He looked at me. You grabbed me, he said. That was dangerous. Yes, I agreed. Why? I considered the question carefully. Because the answer mattered. Because you were right, I said. He blinked. And it would have been inefficient, I added, to let you die after that. He laughed. That's your reason? And, I continued, because you are my colleague. That part was true. And colleagues, I said, protect each other. Marcus nodded slowly. Even the ones who ignore every rule? Especially those, I replied, because someone had to keep them alive. Final resolution. Months passed. The archive reshaped everything. New technologies. New understandings. New warnings. the Valoran civilization, did not survive. But they mattered, because we remembered them, because we learned, and because one human, who wasn't supposed to be there, asked the simplest question in the universe. Weeks later, I received a message from Mira. Another excavation. Another vault. I didn't hesitate. My reply was immediate. Only if we bring Marcus. Her response came seconds later. Already invited. I allowed myself a small smile. Somewhere out there, there would be another impossible problem. Another unbreakable system. Another mystery no one could solve. And when that happened, we wouldn't just bring knowledge. We would bring something far more dangerous. A human. With a flashlight. And the willingness to ask, did you try plugging it in?